Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sir David King. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy. Um, Most of you will know, but Professor Sir David King is very respected, both a emeritus professor of chemistry at the University of Cambridge. He's chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, founder of the Centre for Climate Repair at University of Cambridge. He has been a scientific advisor for the UK government for many years, published more than 500 papers, both on surface science and catalysis, as well as science and policy. What else? I could keep going, and we'll spend an hour and a half talking about your accomplishments. But really, what we'll start, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. I guess first of all, welcome, and will you maybe just start us with how your interest in climate in particular was ignited? Has it got to do with your background and growing up, or was there a specific time that came into focus for you, and you're so dedicated now?
I was a very dedicated physical chemist, and my research area was trying to understand at an atomic and electronic level what is a solid surface. And out of this work emerged all of the stuff on silicon technology, for example. So it became a very big field. It wasn't anything like that when I came into it. And so I wasn't close to the climate change area as a scientist until I came to the University of Cambridge, where I was taking up the professorship of physical chemistry. I came here from Liverpool, and it was at the University of Cambridge where we had a very significant atmospheric sciences group that was set up by one of my predecessors who won a Nobel Prize for his work on a molecule that was hardly understood when he began, and really its importance not recognized. That molecule was ozone. And he developed a very complete understanding of the chemical reactions of this molecule at a nanosecond timescale, and that's what he won his Nobel Prize for. And then, of course, along came the information that the ozone hole was being depleted, the realization that it was CFCs produced by human beings that was very likely the source of this. And the Department of Chemistry became the center of this research into what was happening to the ozone layer. And of course, it then becomes natural that the department became an expert in the area of climate science. We were working very closely with the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics, and that conjunction of physical chemistry with that group meant that we, I think, made some very significant contributions. But I think more than that, it was meeting up with people, for example, John Brown, who was the CEO of BP, had a house here in Cambridge, and I became quite close to John. And he and I started an intense series of discussions on climate change. And John Brown finally went out public saying, I do think the science of climate change is real and that we have to manage it. And that was really my beginnings into the policy issue.
Wow. And I have so many questions just sparked from that. Maybe I'll just jump straight in on the John Brown point and the fossil fuel companies, because of course John Brown I saw him speak the other day, is now focused on investment, of impact investment and combating climate change. How do you see that role having changed over the years of companies like BP, but also other corporates? And what role would you like to see them play now? What was it then?
That's a pretty big question. So let me just
All
know I like it with John Brown, because John Brown, after making this public statement, said that BP no longer stood for British Petroleum. He said it stands for Beyond Petroleum. and he began investing quite heavily in renewable energy systems. He bought up the biggest photovoltaic company in Europe as part of BP's enterprise. Um, but he didn't last long as
Yeah.
CEO. So the board finally got rid of him and put in place a scientist who, or an engineer rather, who was totally dedicated to the fossil fuel industry. So that wasn't a long-lasting process at all. And I fear that that has been repeated time and again with both BP and Shell, where an individual uh, CEO of the group takes a good line, and then oil prices, for example, go up, as we've seen very recently with both Shell and BP. Oil prices go up, and they abandon all of their efforts to get into renewable energy systems, or
Mm,
virtually. And so it unfortunately is true that profits in the oil and gas industry are extremely high. Investors know that they get a 15% return or thereabouts on their investments in the oil and gas industry. And the renewable energy industry, by comparison, is down nearer 5%. So there's the big profit margins are what seduces everybody to
mm.
continue the work in the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, and I guess the because sort of when I speak to us, and I'm sure you do too, especially younger activists or older activists for that matter, we want to put the action at the foot of or in the hands of the CEOs of those big companies that they should just stop. But as you say, they're constrained by their boards, by their investors, and so on. Is that why, or maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, is that why policy becomes so important?
It's why
To
policy
cause,
becomes important, but if I, sorry to interrupt, but if
no,
I
no.
could just say why it's so difficult.
Mm,
If I just say I got involved, of course, in the climate negotiations very heavily and leading up on climate negotiations for the British government from our Foreign Office um, from 2012. And I think it's fair to say that the power of the fossil fuel industry and its lobby system has really prevented us from taking real action on climate change. Why
mm,
else have we not delivered what was being promised back in 1992 when the discussions all began? Quite simply, many of us believed that the United States was the great hegemon. They had led the way in the formation of the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and so on, and that the United States would lead our way out of the climate crisis. Quite the reverse. We kind of took our eye off the ball that the United States is a fossil fuel based country. We
mm,
look at Saudi Arabia, we look at the Middle Eastern countries as the big fossil fuel producers, but so was always the United States, and so it is today.
mm,
And the power of that fossil fuel lobby means that even Obama was unable to sign the agreement that was proposed in Copenhagen in 2008-9. And it meant that we had to abandon the idea that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change could tell countries what they had to do. And that's when we introduced the idea, 2015, the idea that each country could produce its own NCD, nationally determined, NDC, nationally determined contribution. So
mm.
I think the answer to your question is really, why did we go to Dubai for the last meeting?
Yeah,
And why is the next one in Azerbaijan? And in each of those meetings, we've got an oil leader, a CEO of the biggest oil companies in those parts of the world, as the president of the COP meeting. It's, I
yeah.
don't know, it's a bit of a
Well,
isn't it?
it's yeah, well, this is the thing, right? Why are they, why are we allowing that to happen? And is that because for all our noise, I guess, in terms of countries, the US is still fossil fuel based, Norway is still fossil fuel based. we are to a certain extent in need of it, of fossil fuels, or using so many of them. Is that why we're allowing it, or is it because unless we get those countries and those types of companies on board, we won't make the difference? I guess you.
Partly all of that, but I think it's also to do with the fact that I mean, governments are elected by their public, and the public understanding of this crisis has never been very sharp.
Mm,
Yeah. So here's another problem of the negotiating process. We have an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and I know many of the scientists who really devote themselves. There's a good 1,000+ scientists have been involved in producing those reports. But the reports are also faced with political leadership.
mm,
And so it takes 6 years for a report to appear. And in that process, I'm afraid to say, the reports have got watered down each time. And that again is the influence, not just of the fossil fuel lobby, but of the countries that produce fossil fuels and live off them. The power of these countries is represented, again, let me go back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings. Those meetings are pretty difficult to negotiate through because we have an average of 20 official negotiators per country. The United Nations doesn't limit this, and the
yeah.
United States typically is 160 official negotiators. And so you have 4,000 negotiators coming together at each of those.
Mm,
That's a hopeless way to negotiate. But of course, the second thing is at those COP meetings, there is also a very heavy representative from the fossil fuel industry,
yes.
not in the negotiations, but they're in amongst the negotiators at the meetings,
Mm,
maybe 1,500. Right, so it's a large number of fossil fuel representatives who have what they appear to think is a vested interest in their continuation by claiming that the climate scientists are overstating the risks.
mm,
I fear that our ability to foretell what would happen with climate change, and that, I mean, the first big projection was 1897 from the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius, who said, if we continue burning fossil fuels, he said, 1897, we will create a crisis because we will add so much in the way of greenhouse gases. The temperatures would rise by about 5 degrees centigrade if we were to double uh, greenhouse gas levels. We're now approaching double, exactly as he said. But of course, many other scientists have been saying what the dangers are. But I just wonder whether we have to actually be faced with these risks
mm.
individually,
Before.
or we really begin to understand that it is a crisis and that we have to take crisis measures.
No, I would agree. I remember hearing John Kerry say that acting on climate wouldn't mean any change to the American lifestyle, which terrified me when he said that because it's clearly not true.
Yeah.
Um, do you, if we turn the spotlight a bit to the scientists, because again, we know the science is there, as you say, it's been there for a long time, and scientists like yourself are getting louder, I think. But do you think, and you talked about taking your eye off the ball with the US in that context. Do you think that there's a sort of chasm between the science and then communicating it to, I'm going to say, ordinary people, um, and politicians for that matter? Then that's why we're going to need to face into the disaster even more than we are today before we will really change our behaviors.
So I think, I mean, I'm going to say yes, but let me expand my answer a bit because I think that what follows from this is you may know that 2023 was not just the hottest year on record. We've had many previous hottest years over the last 10 years. But it was hotter. Every other year has been more like zero point 0.1 degrees centigrade hotter. It was hotter by more than 0.5 degrees centigrade. And the last 12 months, the average temperature rise compared with the pre-industrial level for the whole planet is now at 1.65 degrees centigrade. So that target of staying below 1.5 is at least for the last 12 months exceeded. And this has produced a whole series of remarkable extreme weather events and loss and damage around the world from the last 4 or 5 years, but 2023 exceptional, is probably amounting to about $500 billion a year. I'm trying to put figures on it, but it's very
Mm,
easy to produce a figure from the United States. It's well in excess of $150 billion. But if you take that figure of loss and damage and then ask, well, who's paying for that? And I'm afraid the answer is we only measure success through gross domestic product, GDP. And when you have loss and damage, you have to spend money fixing it, and so GDP goes up. So it's
yeah,
not.
it doesn't reflect where we are.
Yeah. So I think, however, we saw in 2021 the extreme hot weather in the west coast of North America, all the way up to Canada, and this town of Lytton up in British Columbia, where the residents were what we would describe as upper middle class. 135 died of heat stress because the heat wave stayed there for a couple of weeks and the temperature reached 49.6 degrees centigrade in Canada. Now, the reason there were so many deaths from a heat wave is simply because Canadians don't have air conditioning. Why
Yeah,
would you in this cold country? So this was a temperature in excess of any previous by much more than 10 degrees centigrade. Now, these are the events that might waken people up, but it's frankly very late in the day.
yeah,
Can I just say one more little fact?
you'd like.
Um, we just had a big report produced from NASA in the
Yes.
United States on the loss of ice from Greenland. And this is a long-range study, a very detailed study of the loss of ice on Greenland. 50 million tons of ice an hour being lost from Greenland. And if all of Greenland ice melts, and I'm afraid it looks as if it could be irreversible now without human intervention, if all of Greenland ice melts and nothing else, sea levels would rise by 7.5 meters, by 24 feet.
Mm, which is
And yeah, disaster
incomprehensible. Yeah,
is.
absolutely. I want to come back to that point that I heard you imply about human intervention, but just before that, I just want to dig in a little bit more on um, so how we link that loss and damage, because one thing is saying, oh, extraordinary climate events or weather events. Um, is there a job? And I know that there are several people on the call who have been looking at this as a project. How do we communicate or link that loss and damage directly to our actions, to fossil fuels? More specifically, is there a job of the creative industries to get, I'm going to say, nations and the civil society to start understanding that and acting differently? Or have we gone beyond that point? It's not nothing we can say to give agency to, I'm going to say, normal people?
Whenever I talk to a group about climate change, and I've done it 4 times this week already, what I do is start by telling them how the science of climate change was developed. And it all begins with the great French mathematician Fourier in 1824. He publishes a paper which is the mathematical and physical basis of how we look at climate change today. And in that paper, he said, I know how much solar energy is arriving at the surface of the Earth, and I know how the radiation leaving the Earth changes with temperature of the surface of the Earth. So I can therefore calculate the temperature at the surface of the Earth accurately by equating these two.
Yep.
And he gets a value initially, which he puts down in his paper, that was 30 degrees centigrade too low. And so then he has to introduce what we would call a fudge factor, what Fourier would call a coefficient, to allow for the fact that, and we understand this, if you're lying in your bed at night and you're cold, you put a duvet over yourself, you capture the radiated energy in the duvet. And he said the atmosphere is acting just like that, like a duvet over the earth. It's capturing some of the radiated energy and keeping us warmer than we would otherwise be. So he calculates the actual temperature of the average of the Earth, and he gets the right number by putting the right coefficient in. Then we get 1860 Irish scientist Tyndall comes along and measures how much energy is captured by air.
Hmm.
There's a very careful measurement in which he first of all removes all the junk from the air. So he takes out water vapor, methane, and carbon dioxide. And he then shows that the coefficient that Fourier should have used was zero. However, fortunately, he repeats the experiment with air as it is with all of that stuff in it, and he
Hmm.
gets Fourier's coefficient almost exactly.
Wow.
That's a beautiful piece of science, right? That begins to tell you that we're understanding how the climate of the planet is determined and how the average temperature is determined. And then we jump to Svante Arrhenius, 1896, says, wow, we are producing carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels and removing forests. And so we are potentially causing ourselves a lot of trouble. I think it's very important to put all this down before you start talking about where we are today, because there's the climate models that are used today still base themselves on what was done in the 19th century. And much of science is like that. We keep adding complications. We have vast computer capacity, so we can do it much more accurately, but
Mm.
nevertheless, the science is not some modern feature.
And And so why are we not managing? So first of all, thank you. I think laying it out like that actually is a wonderful foundation for discussing and where we are today. Um, and and again, thank you for us being the fourth group of people you're talking to. I think everybody's very grateful. Um, so how do we communicate this in a way that we accelerate the understanding and the implications of our own choices and actions, whether we are a single person or somebody who has power in a corporation or in a government or of some kind of role. How do we do that? Do we need to activate people more with different language? Because it just feels like scientists are getting more and more frustrated, rightly so, because nobody has taken it seriously enough to act.
So I'm going to say two things to this. One is, um, who is one of the most popular TV broadcasters in the world? It's got to be David Attenborough.
Absolutely.
60 years he's been broadcasting, and even the films he produced 60 years ago are still often shown. Uh, Talking to the mountain gorillas in Rwanda,
Yes.
amazing shots. And the point is that Attenborough in his 90s is still producing films and is still watched very widely. Now, I know David quite well now, and I have to tell you that 15 years ago, he didn't worry at all about climate change.
Mm,
So he's shifted ground very dramatically on that. So I think as soon as you can get to that level of communication, using the power of film, using the power of television, we make an awful lot of progress, and it has to be done by somebody of David Attenborough's capability to
true.
reach that bigger audience. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is to understand the power of the opposition that we're up against.
Mm,
So, for example, Climate scientists work for the United Nations through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they became, after Copenhagen, and there was a great hoo-ha about climate scientists cheating on the numbers. Right? A massive piece of work being produced, of course, by the fossil fuel industry. And the result of this was numerous climate scientists simply stepped away from the public domain. They kept
Mm.
publishing their papers, but their papers aren't read by the public. Their
No.
papers are complicated computational and mathematical pieces of work.
Yeah.
They're not interpretations that are needed. They themselves can do that, but they really en masse began to withdraw from that because they didn't like being faced with this absurd opposition that they couldn't answer. Right?
Yeah.
Now, when I was in government, I was in a different position. And so what I found, Tony Blair said, okay, get around the world, talk about climate change wherever you can. And I did that. And then I discovered there was in many parts of the world, whether it was Argentina or California or Europe, the same guy sitting in the back would put up a hand and he never asked a question. He simply said, you have just given a totally biased story of the account of climate science. The other half of the climate science community totally disagree with you. Now,
Mm.
I had the ability, because I was in government, to go to our security services. And I simply said, who is this?
Yes. Uh,
And they came back and told me not only who he was, but who was funding him. And so the next time he stood up, I named him and told him I knew where the money was coming from and was it still coming in at the same rate. And he never appeared again. Now, that's an absurd way to handle a discussion. But
no, absolutely.
and most climate scientists don't have that ability to respond in that way.
No. Having yeah, I was going to say having the Secret Service at your fingertips is pretty good. Do you maybe we should talk a little bit more about that time in government because it was quite a long time. So you started in 2000, is that right? And so saw several prime ministers and and I guess still looking at them, even if you're not directly working with them now. I was going to say, was there any pushback in those days? Was there the pragmatism? You said Tony Blair said, go talk about climate change and so on. But but did he provide also the action? Or what were
Yes.
the
Yeah.
considerations?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a very, very big question. The only reason I took the job as chief scientific advisor with Tony Blair was because I thought I could have a voice on climate change.
Yeah.
Um, but here's the irony. You don't get to see a prime minister very often as chief scientific advisor. And then we had a foot and mouth disease outbreak in February 2020, 2001. And it was on my bailiwick. I was chief scientific advisor. And what I realized was that the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, which has now disappeared,
Yeah.
was not handling it in the right way. And so I got a group of experts together and we modeled it. And then I went to Blair and said, this is what we should do.
Hmm.
Blair, in his autobiography, says, at this point, I couldn't really understand what this science guy was telling me, but he's the only person who had a solution. So he just handed it over to me and he said, you're doing all of the media work, you're going on television and radio. I was on television and radio every day of the week for the
Cool.
next few months.
Yeah.
But I was also seeing the Prime Minister every morning. Right. So
That,
suddenly we developed a very good relationship. And in real time, because what I was advising was very successful, and he was able to call an election on the back of my curves, right?
must have been good for politicians. Yes.
Because of this, I was able to say to him, now listen, I do want to talk to you about climate change. So I spent a few hours with him And this is at the point where he says, okay, get on with it. And we upped our game massively. We put 165 climate attaches in our embassies around the world to let every ambassador know that we treated climate change as our major challenge.
Mm-hmm.
We put in place a climate negotiating budget, which is almost unbelievably large today. Over 10 years, £9 billion. All right. So you can imagine that at that point, we became global leader on action on climate change. So it was without the foot and mouth disease epidemic, I doubt that would have happened.
Isn't
If
that interesting? Unintended consequences.
yes, in the best possible way.
Yes, absolutely. Um, and and then I guess let's if you don't mind, let's fast forward. So because Britain at many points feels like we've been leading on climate in terms of policy and regulation. I was in a meeting earlier today with the UN Global Compact. We were talking about, transition plans being mandatory in the UK before elsewhere and so on. What do we need to do now? Because to continue to lead on policy from where you're sitting, and obviously it's different when you're here versus in government speaking to the Prime Minister, but what would you like to see happen? Both, maybe, yeah, let's start with the UK and then we can go to
All
others.
right. So I'm going to say that I worked closely with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
And then I left government for a period and I was brought back by David Cameron. And so I worked with David Cameron in his coalition government days and then also into his days with a conservative government. And then I worked with Theresa May. So I've worked
I
with both
love
political parties. And I'm saying that because now I want to say there's no doubt in my mind we have to vote in the Labour Party,
Oh,
right?
wow. Okay.
And I'm saying that because, frankly, I think from everything he's been saying, our Prime Minister is a climate skeptic.
Mm.
For example, electric vehicles. We were ahead of the world in saying that after 2030, no fossil fuel driven uh, motor car or motorbike even would be allowed on our roads, and now that's been delayed to 2035. The net zero targets, he's saying we shouldn't bother with that now. Now, of course, there's a problem for the Prime Minister at the moment because go back to 2008, we, I believe, are still the only democracy in the world where we had all party agreement on reducing emissions by 80% by 2050.
Yeah.
Party agreement. I think there were five
Yeah.
against that agreement. And so it has been binding, and the climate crisis, the Climate Change Committee of Parliament was set up as a result of that agreement. It was a Climate Change Committee of Parliament so that the committee would continue from one government to another, whatever the colour of the government.
Yeah.
So the policy would be coherent even through changes of government. Now, that was an amazing piece of achievement, I think. And we were certainly the first country to do that. I know that several Scandinavian countries have been looking at how we managed to achieve that. And it is very important because it's still in place. So, however, the chairman, Lord Deben of the Climate Change Committee, resigned, I think, about 18 months ago.
Yeah.
And the Prime Minister has been sitting on the recommendations of the committee to find a replacement, and he hasn't nominated a replacement. So I think that, again, is just an illustration of that. However, the Climate Change Committee of Parliament is still working. They're still setting out clear targets for us out to well towards 2050, what needs to be done in order to achieve that target.
Mm.
I think not everything has been undone, but a number of things have been seriously slowed down just when we need to be doing the reverse.
Yeah. And maybe this links back to the conversation because I can see some questions in the chat around GDP. And maybe that links to the fact that the Prime Minister, as a politician, and government are thinking, well, the measures for growth, the measures for what the public want, go against taking that action on climate change. So you mentioned that the issue, for example, and jumping to that macro issue of we're measuring growth on GDP. Everybody wants to say we're growing. There's an obsession, it seems, in particular. And Sophie Toff in the chat, she asked really specifically, do you think there's a way to redefine and expand how we measure that progress or things of value that might help shift the public consciousness and accelerate public action, positive action? Is the way forward to place a financial value on ecosystem services, so put a price on nature, or other ways of emphasizing that?
So first of all, let me say I fully agree with Sophie in the implications of her question. But however,
Mhm.
here's a curious factor. We now are producing 42% of our electricity. This is the last two terms from renewable energy.
Yeah.
Not out of kilter with the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe is close to 40% as well. They've caught up with us. But nevertheless, 42% from renewable energy, and most of that is from offshore wind.
Mm.
Now, I can tell you that I had a really seriously bad night when the government said we've got to give in to the public. They don't want any more onshore wind because
Yeah.
I, like everybody else, offshore wind is going to be very expensive.
Yeah.
Offshore wind in Britain is now the most productive electricity system of offshore wind in the world. And the reason is because the marine engineers who came over from the fossil fuel industry in the North Sea came over to work for the companies in the offshore wind industry were able to show us how to get enormous wind turbines up with very long blades, and these are very, very efficient. Now, the cost of electricity from those wind turbines is actually less than we could produce from any other new type of electricity production.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say the biggest growth factor in our economy has been the offshore wind industry, the new biggest growth factor, right? So that it's a good big employer of people and
Absolutely.
it is running at profits. So it's not as if this is costing us money, it's quite the reverse. Now, I'm not going to say that is the bottom part of the argument at all, but nevertheless, it is incorrect to say that it's bad for GDP growth. As it happens for the UK, it's incorrect. And if we move towards electric cars, I mean, what one of the interesting things is the electric cars, for example, every one of these Chinese cars or every one of these new Volkswagens that are electric come into if you buy it, come in with a charger that is an intelligent charger system
Yes.
so that it picks up electricity. You plug into your electricity at night, it only picks up electricity when the price of the electricity is very low,
No,
when
fantastic, isn't it? Yeah.
electricity is in overproduction. This means we can energize all of our car systems at very little additional electricity demand on the grid. It will be an increase in demand, but nothing like the oil and gas that we have to import to keep these things running. So I think the arguments go the other way. However, I want to pick up on what Sophie's question is involved with in saying that I believe we need to move towards an ecological civilization. I think we need a full culture change. What we have is the consequences of the very successful development of global economies, the very successful increase in human well-being arising from our economic system. And that economic system, unfortunately, gives no value to ecosystems. Right. So what I believe we need to have is a culture shift into an ecological civilization in which every government gives the same attention to ecosystems well-being as it gives to human well-being. And I'm
Yes.
using the phrase well-being. I'm not using the phrase wealth.
Yes. No, um, I'm with you. It's what when in our work, and I know you and I've discussed this before, is we talk about a regenerative economy and where all life is flourishing of all life is the aim, right? That it can replenish itself and so on. Um, and I'm just going to pick up on one question before we move off of the politics completely. It's from Laurie Moulton Ulrich. Um, do you see our party system, I guess in the UK, capable of getting itself off our accelerating environment, human degradation? Do we not have to look at society and how it decides it wants to be governed, i.e., how decisions which impact collective interaction? That's also quite a big question, just to keep you on your toes.
Yes, it's a very important question because I'm still traveling the world. I'm still talking to governments around the world. During my time in government, I spent a lot of time in bilateral negotiations, and I'm keeping that side open through the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. Let's just draw a comparison between the world's biggest democracy, India, and
Mhm.
the autocracy of China.
Yes, let's do that.
In 2020, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, announced that they would build 1,400 gigawatts of renewable electricity by 2030. Now, just to place that number in context, we have a total of around 100 gigawatts of electricity on our grid. 1,400 gigawatts of renewable electricity would be much more than the rest of the world put together by 2030. We're just busy working on a report that hasn't been completed yet, in which we're saying actually they've already achieved 1,200 gigawatts, 2024, and by the end of this year, it's probably going to be closer to 1,400 gigawatts. It's rising exponentially.
Mm.
When decisions are made in China, they are made very effectively. And what they are keen to do is to manage the climate change situation. And by the way, I've stolen the term ecological civilizations from China. They have now written that into the constitution of the government of China,
Yes.
their objective. And so let's just compare that with India. I was into Prime Minister Modi's office within 2 weeks of his election, because he announced that he wished to solarize India from top to bottom. I'm quoting from his speech accepting the presidency. And at the point that I went out there to see him, he didn't have many visitors. And so I managed to get into the office. And I simply said, that is wonderful, and we can work with you. And I'm trying to set up something called Mission Innovation, which would pull together all of the willing nations to put their money, their public money, into developing all of the technology to
Mm.
enable us to move away from fossil fuels. And he said, absolutely. And the next G20 meeting, he took that proposal to the G20 meeting. He's very committed to this action.
Mm.
How successful is he?
Well, this is it.
Not nearly as successful. I mean, he doesn't manage to control the democratic procedures in anything like the way the autocratic. Now, I'm not keen to see the
Goodness.
end of the liberal systems that we live in, but I do enormously admire what China is able to deliver. Can
It's
I just say,
yeah.
in the year 2000 and 2020, so we've produced a report on China. Between 2000 and 2020, we estimate that 850 million people have been taken out of poverty in China over that period of time. Now, what that derives from is that amazing period of growth, 12 to 15% GDP growth per
Mhm.
annum. but it also derives from their socialist principles. So what we see is that well-being means that they've got this massive new middle class demanding much more electricity. That's why they're building more nuclear power, more renewables, more hydropower than the rest of the world put together to meet this new demand.
Yeah.
So it's
It's really interesting. So two things. So we James Thornton, founder of Client Earth, was on book club, I'm going to say 18 months ago, it might have been longer, also talking about he had gone to China and helped them build some of those ecological concepts into their judicial system and training some of the judges. It was a really interesting perspective that I hadn't heard before. And I just wonder, how do you balance that with what some people might call sort of eco-fascism, that we just need the autocrats to tell us where we're going, um, and um, and do it effectively because democracy is too slow. And of course, you've got other people like Rebecca Willis, who says we need more democracy and more citizens' assemblies to involve people to really make this change stick. I guess there's a big spectrum.
This is the big discussion we have to have now.
Yeah,
I believe that the age of the United States economic dominance of the world is now coming to an end, and we're
yeah,
seeing real problems in the US democratic system as a result of this. And what emerges globally is now an open question, and I'm afraid it could go in two opposite directions. And I think we all need to be involved in this discussion. Uh,
mm,
the idea of multiplying democracy is an interesting one. I'm fully aware of Client Earth's presence in China.
yes,
Its second biggest office is in China,
yeah,
and I'm shortly going out to China and I'm meeting up with them there. Um, it is important to recognize that the Chinese way of thinking is
mhm,
part of their philosophy. Right? If we look at Confucianism and Taoism, Confucianism is more to do with running a good civil service. But Taoism, I'm simplifying, but Taoism is about nature and us being a part of nature and not
yeah,
a part of nature. And in Chinese schools today, despite that communist system controlling it, they're not taught Marxism, they're taught Taoism.
yeah,
And so the idea in China of an ecological civilization just fits straight in with their cultural development.
yeah.
Not true of ours.
I was going to
It,
say, so interesting, right? That do we need to have some of those more, um, yeah, I was going to say Asian-based philosophies and values in our lives, in society, in business?
it's no surprise that James Thornton, who you and I know, the guy who
Yeah,
started Planet Earth, is a Buddhist monk.
yeah, yeah,
He has converted to Buddhism, and Buddhism is again a religion that is very close to nature.
yeah,
And we all know that every Chinese New Year is named after a given animal.
yes. Not
There's
a
a
coincidence.
that is a respect for nature.
Yeah,
So
really interesting.
yeah, how do we move on from our cultural traditions? That's an enormous challenge.
And again, for what I'm seeing is that there is this movement. It feels like there is a convergence of these ideas also in our westernized capitalist societies around nature becoming, and it's still bubbling under, it's still not mainstream, but and one of the ways I see it reflected is in communities and the focus of doing things that are more local, place-based, and so on. Um, and and I wonder, and and how do we rebalance that with the global, the global society we've had and built and benefited from, as you said, over the last decades and decades. Do you, on that note, do you do you see the institutions such as the UN and others still as relevant? Will they be relevant in 10 years, do you think?
I hope so. I don't want to abandon the only organization we have where every country has a voice.
Mm,
I think that that would be a very backward step.
yeah.
I think the way to manage this let's come back to the point about communities.
Yes.
In our societies, communities don't reflect what I believe is a true communitarian approach.
Mm,
In a community, we share things.
yes.
I mean, I have fallen in love with a Greek island. It's a Greek island which, when I first went there, didn't have many tourists. It's quite close to the Turkish border, to Turkey,
Yes.
and the people on the island, if somebody has a car, they'll lend it to anybody else. Uh,
Mm, it's a
If
community.
if they've got a piece of land, and most of them have a piece of land, and they overproduce fruit or vegetables, they simply leave overproduction on the doorsteps of neighbors. They don't tell the neighbor, I left this for you. It's a matter of just sharing out. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this, but nevertheless, there is a culture there that is still in place,
Mm,
that we've lost. So I'm going to go back to what you were originally saying about, do we have to spread democracy right out into communities? And I do think we have to. And by the way, this isn't far from where China is. If you want to know where members of the Politburo come from, they come from local community groups, electing them into bigger and bigger groups. So you have to be produced. Xi Jinping, for example, comes from a very poor town, and has a very poor background. But he rose up through the systems. So they've got all these communities electing their leaders, and the leaders are expected to go on right up into running this vast country. Now, I'm not going to say that they've got all the answers at all, but nevertheless, they've got some of the answers that we need to learn from.
yeah. No, agreed. And on that, just two little things. I saw there's a question from Lucy Philby, who's one of our very regular, wonderful book club members based up in Scotland. And she says, how do you ensure that communities most impacted by wind power developments are actually powered by them? Here, most of the communities impacted are actually still on oil. So any thoughts to that? And it's a very specific question, but I thought we'd just
Very
mention.
important question.
Yeah.
So I think that the immediate answer that I would give is there has been a failing in the understanding of connecting grids to wind turbines. So quite often, what you've just said is correct, that
Mm,
in many cases, people are still burning oil, which is unbelievable in a country that has so much wind turbine power. So it's a matter of interconnecting grids. I think the real answer to this question is that we have to have, yes, communities, but we also have to have a holistic view, so that no community gets left out of the overall
mm,
improvement in processes. And one of the big things about renewable energy systems is that they can be made to be local. And this is a very big factor in Africa, and I've seen this happening quickly. People learn that if you put up solar panels, you can charge batteries, and you can then have electricity at night. You don't have to have every village in Africa connected to the grid. And the cost of doing this is so much less. And
mm.
yet the empowering process is enormous. And I'm going to give you an example. There's a small town outside Bristol, and I met the man who did this. He'd retired from his job in London, went back to his hometown near Bristol, and he'd made a bit of money. And so he went to the local council and he said, I want to build a wind turbine that will provide all of us with the electricity we need.
Yes.
So they did, they built it, and within 3 years, they had paid back the capital cost of building this wind turbine, and none of them pay for electricity now. So in other words, when they're not using it, they put it onto the grid and get paid for that. And then when they need it off the grid, there's no wind, they get that effectively free of
Yeah.
charge.
It's fantastic, isn't it? There's a street in London, in East London, that have done the same thing, where
Yes.
they're powering the whole street, um, based, by themselves. And again, lots of fundraising beforehand. Let's move a little bit on, I guess. I want to come back to something you said because I I hear this debate quite a lot. I was lucky enough 2 years ago to go to Greenland. Lucky and sad. As a Danish person, it was an ambition of mine for a very long time, but I was also faced with how Denmark has treated the Greenland population, and honestly, that's not a good thing, and as well as the melting ice and so on. Um, you said something that I feel like we have to pick up on. You said without human intervention, it is unlikely that that we can or that the ice will stop melting, and then we have more than 7 meters of sea rises. Um, the That to me sounds like either biomimicry, and we should help nature in its own way, or geoengineering, which then comes with some connotations. And I just want to touch on that, not a long piece, but I think that's one of the choices we stand with right now as society, is how much do we want to intervene in those types of situations, tipping point situations.
So I'm going to say, first of all, a big broad statement. We've gone too far.
Mm-hmm.
We are, the fact that we're losing so much ice from Greenland already probably means it's irreversible without human intervention. And therefore, the life cycle of humanity is going to come grinding to a halt in anything like the form we have now. Rising sea levels, if I just mention the country of Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
85% of the country is so close to sea level that by 2050, our projection is that that country will be under seawater at least once a year in 2050, 85% of the landmass. Now, that's where the third biggest rice producer in the world is. That delta that forms Vietnam,
Yeah.
these large
Right.
flat paddy fields, which is very productive in rice production. What happens when rice stops being produced in Vietnam after it's been salinated by seawater? So there are enormous challenges ahead of us. There's another problem. The way the Arctic Circle region is heating up at 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet, and this includes the permafrost regions. And
Yeah.
now we're getting explosive release of methane from the permafrost regions. There's enough methane there that if it was all emitted over a 20-year period, which is possible with these explosive releases, global temperatures would rise by 5 to 8 degrees centigrade. So you put these two challenges together, and my conclusion is very simple. We have to learn how to keep ice covering the Arctic Sea during the polar summer months. So at the moment, during the polar winter months, the ice regrows over the Arctic Sea. But 3 days into the polar summer, the sun coming back to
Yeah.
3 days after that, the ice is gone. And you've got 50% of the Arctic Sea exposed to sunlight. And of course, the blue sea soaks it up. It warms up incredibly quickly, and the air above it warms up very quickly. And what we're seeing is all the challenges that flow from this. So I do think it's an imperative that we buy time to enable us to A, stop using fossil fuels, and B, remove excess greenhouse gases that are already up there.
Mm.
We have to learn how to remove greenhouse gases at scale and get on with it. And we also then have to learn how to refreeze the Arctic during those polar summer months so that we can keep the ice there and stop this awful challenge that I've just mentioned. So I don't think we've got any choice. I think we have to do this. Otherwise, frankly, my little granddaughter, who's 4 years old, is not likely to be thinking about her grandchildren by the end of this century. Right.
That puts it into perspective. Thank you. I guess there's the other side to that. If I'm going to challenge you a little bit on it, just to dig, is I spent some time recently with some Guatemalan land defenders, who are wonderful, and very effective in getting policy changed and so on. And one of their sort of stances or opinions was, indigenous people, we have the wisdom, we know what the solutions are to this climate challenge, let's call it that, um, and using current tools like technology to overcome those is the wrong, is the wrong way, because we can't quite do it. Do you want to just, yeah,
Unpack that. Yeah.
yeah, how
So
does that play
we get
in?
the same pushback from the Sami and Inuit people living on the permafrost.
Yeah.
So I'm saying to them, one of them was on my climate crisis advisory group, a professor of climate science who lives on the permafrost in northern Finland. First of all, let me say, I spoke to him in April 2021,
Mm-hmm.
just chatting. What's the local temperature? I said, and he said, oh, it's bloody cold today. It's minus 30. I spoke to him a few months later, the end of July the same year when the sun has come back, and he said, unbelievable. The temperature today is plus 32,
In
plus
northern Finland.
on the permafrost in northern Finland. So
Right.
this is the warm air over the Arctic Blue Sea blowing towards where he was. So it just happened that the wind was blowing in that direction. So he understands the nature of the threat to their lifestyle, but nevertheless, and he's a spokesperson for the Inuit and Sami people, nevertheless, he could not agree to what I'm saying. So he actually resigned from the Climate Crisis Advisory. He was asked to resign by his people. So there is a real challenge here. We have ignored the indigenous people of the world. I'm talking about the
Yeah.
Westerners.
Yeah.
We have, so I come from South Africa. The indigenous people who've lived on the desert, the Kalahari Desert in South
Mm.
Africa, probably the oldest community in the world. They date right back to the beginnings of human societies. And they've lived on that Kalahari Desert for all that time.
Mm.
They know how to live in that area, which is not an easy area to live on. But of course, they've been virtually wiped out.
Yeah.
And that's true of many of the indigenous communities around the world. Now, I don't believe that their lifestyle, I admire their position because they give us an example of how to live with nature.
Mm.
I don't think we can adapt in that way. We have to manage the crisis that we've created, and then we have to learn how to be a fully ecologically civilized group of people.
Okay. No, thank you. That's really helpful. You've maybe we just very briefly, the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. Do you want to just talk very briefly to what you do, just so that everybody knows? I know we've sort of mentioned it a couple of times.
Right. So the Climate Crisis Advisory Group I initiated about 3 years ago, and the idea was to put together leading climate experts from around the world. And I wanted it to be representative, so we have people from the north and the south. And the idea, and we're mostly a bit older than average, but nevertheless, we've got some young people as well. So the idea was to create a group that are all knowledgeable contributors to the development of our understanding of climate science and its challenges, and recognizably so.
Mhm.
The most recognizable person we've got is Johan Rockstrom, but he's just an example of the level of people we have.
Yeah.
And then we have a group running the report production, but the reports are all written by members of the group. So we've produced 20 reports in the last 3 years. Very pleased to be able to say that the Secretary General of the United Nations has let it be known that he reads all of our reports.
Fantastic.
It is. And the point is that we produce them quickly. So that climate crisis that happened in northern Finland
Yes.
in July, we
Yeah.
produced a report at the beginning of August that year on not just what was happening, but the causes of it.
Okay.
So we're able to operate much more quickly than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change can. And I deliberately raise all the funds to keep us going from individual philanthropists.
Right.
So we are not beholden to any political organization. We're not beholden to any financial organization either. Actually, I should also say we're now getting money from philanthropic bodies. But
Wonderful.
the idea is that we are not beholden to anyone. We are a group of scientists who can say what we believe is the best way to understand the situation.
Great. And now that, thank you. I just want to make sure everybody knows what it is and maybe can go and look it up. The
By the way, can I just say, tomorrow, Thursday, um, we have a public meeting every month, and we have a public meeting, and I'm going to be presenting a paper that I'm a co-author on with 18 other co-authors that's being published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences Nexus, and that's obviously a very important journal. And the paper is called Earth at Risk. Right.
right.
So that is the title of the paper, Earth at Risk. And we are talking about exactly what I'm saying, biodiversity, climate change, inequality, all of these things are the big challenges we're faced with. How do we put that together and deal with it? So this is
That's maybe one of my team could put the link to that and the in the chat so everybody ha has that. That so as you were describing the climate crisis advisory group, it reminded me of something else I saw when and you've talked a little bit about when we've spoken previously, that you're a little bit of I'm going to say not a provocateur, but um, a rebel or a revolutionary in the sense that you were also the person during the pandemic to set up a shadow SAGE committee that was independent to sort of shadow the UK government's SAGE committee on how to address those issues. Do you think we need all of us to do a little bit more of that? Put us, in a sense, when we look at you and your fantastic career, you are an establishment person, but really, I see, I see the rebel in you, and the need to maybe, I don't know how comfortable you feel outside, but to say, right, we're going to raise different money, we're going to do this differently in order to put some pressure on the system. Should we all be doing that? Is that we should be emulating that, or what do you think?
so I think, I mean, the idea of setting up that group, which we called an alternative group, but you describe it as a shadow group, was quite simple. That we I put together a group of absolutely leading experts in this country on disease management.
Mhm.
So it critically important to understand that we were only about a dozen people. And the government chief scientific advisor had set up 3 panels, enormous panels, and it was very difficult for him, I think, to extract a very clear message. When you just have a group of a dozen people, you can extract very clear messages. And we were terrified by what was being done.
Mm.
There was very little understanding of the fact that we know how to handle infectious diseases. You have to be able to detect people who've got the disease and then separate them from the rest of the population. The worst outcome of not doing that is that you shut down the economy. So, that was never our idea. Our idea was to detect the disease, make sure that every GP was involved. Now, what the government decided to do was put heavy sums of money into the new private sector bodies to try and deliver a management of the disease. And this was disastrous. It
Mm,
was virtually nothing. So it was, I think, ideologically driven. They believe that the private sector always does better than the public sector. And yet we have this wonderful National Health Service with GPs right throughout the country. Just an incredible wrong lead. Now, we didn't go out to criticize the government. We always went out to advise what should be done at every stage of the epidemic. We
mm,
tried to avoid being critical. I'm sitting here being critical now because I'm explaining it was out of sheer frustration. It wasn't my idea, by the way. I was approached by others. And then the Climate Crisis Advisory Group grew out of that.
mm.
So
Okay,
it
I didn't
was
realize.
me discussing it with the chap who was leading on the PR and comms for the shadow group, saying, "What about doing this for climate change on an international scale?" And that really is the beginning of the CCAG.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So, I'm looking at time. We don't have that much time left. So, um, yes, I do want to hear your thoughts on, do we all need to do something different, be frustrated and and push, and any advice on that? Because of course, um, some people might think it's easier for you. You have the ability to pull together 12 of the best scientists on disease management. If we talk about the pandemic and global climate change and action when we talk about the CCAG. But
Well, Louise, look at what you're doing right now. I mean, that's a very good example of reaching out way beyond your own offices. Right. And so I think each one of us is in a different situation to deliver what we can. But the answer to your question is yes, please do what you can. We have an enormous global challenge on our hands. And I do want to say we've got to always try to keep North and South together in these discussions.
yeah,
Critically important that it isn't a Western group of white people always discussing it.
yes, no, agreed. I'm just glancing at the last few questions we can squeeze in before we've got 6 more minutes. So thank you for your time. But Puya Thiel is saying that the WEF Global Risks Report really highlights misinformation and disinformation as one of the key threats in the short term. Obviously, there's also climate on that risk spectrum. You mentioned your experience of this, of the misinformation, disinformation in your climate talks. How do we tackle this challenge, respecting the very different perspectives of people who are dedicated to favorite solutions, for example, including Indigenous people or Extinction Rebellion? Thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one.
Yeah, it is. It's very important, and the most important thing is that those people who understand that our entire life abilities are delivered through understanding of how the world works through science, technology, engineering. And so when people come along and question scientists, that really has to be dealt with very, very smartly. Now, it's not always easy. I'm inclined now to tell you another little story.
Go on. We don't have long, but I would love to hear it.
Yeah,
I'm
so
sure everybody else would
so,
too.
Britain, of course, we were big colonizers and we colonized many islands around the world. And those islands don't want independence because we are effectively their big system of managing to stay within the world. And so as a result, we attend the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, there were no ministers in government when I was in this is early 2015 when the Pacific Island Forum heads of government met. So I went out to represent Britain. And the Australian Prime Minister, one of the Prime Ministers there, made this belligerent speech saying, you islanders have to stop worrying about climate change, just develop your economies and you will manage everything very well. He was saying effectively that the science of climate change was a nonsense. And the New Zealand Prime Minister was sitting next to him and seemed embarrassed, but nevertheless said, I agree with my colleague. They must have had a discussion beforehand.
Yeah, that's
Now, I then got hold of our ambassador from Fiji who was there. He contacted Number 10 and said, Sir David wants to change government policy from getting to stay below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level to 1.5, which is what the islanders wanted. And I got an answer back almost immediately. Fine, tell him to go ahead. So I did it.
wow.
What I said was, we too are an island nation. And like you, we are faced with massive challenges from sea level rise. And so I totally support you, and the British government supports you. When the meeting ended, the Prime Minister from Australia had gone. He left the meeting, got in his plane, and flew back to Australia. I walked straight into the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they pointed a microphone at me and said, "You are live on Australian news tonight,
Mhm.
and we want to ask you. You've just totally disagreed with our Prime Minister." Now, I'm not a Prime Minister. That was a very difficult. But what I did was just repeat what I had said. I just want to tell you what happened. Australian Prime Minister, when he landed, found he'd lost his job.
Oh.
Sometimes things happen in a way that you don't quite expect. Now, obviously, he was on a knife edge before that,
Yes, but
uh, but nevertheless, this might have just tipped him over.
I hope that there are several countries that could do with your intervention then over the next year or so, if that's the effect. There's a few people we could do with losing, or um, I'm very aware of time, and we've got through some of the questions. We'll try and pick up maybe offline some of the other questions that we haven't quite touched. There's been some brilliant conversation going on in the chat, and people have been advising each other, which is even better. And we will share the chat with everybody, and the video will be up. I have two sort of final questions for you. One is who else do you think we should be talking to? Are there any brilliant books or people that are doing thinking, maybe not just climate, but around systems? Maybe somebody from the global south that you admire, because quite frankly, we're trying to keep views diverse. So I'd love your recommendation if you have any.
I will
Um,
come back to you with that.
yeah, no, and it doesn't have to be now on live, but I would love to pick your brain a little bit on that. And then most people on this call are on it because they want to make a difference and have an impact. And we talked a little bit about using your voice and gathering people beyond what you have to do in your job or in your life. Is there anything else, particularly for the young people? So you'll see lots of young faces on this call of people who, some of them work for Volans, and we're really lucky to have them, but also others. What would, I guess, be their advice, your advice to them? Most of them I know want to have an impact, yet live in a world where despair is quite close because of the situation that I guess we older generations have created.
There's a very important point to be made here that despair gets us nowhere and pessimism gets us nowhere. We've all got to keep a sense of positivity and optimism about this. I keep reminding myself that Goliath didn't beat David. So although the giants seem to be massively in control, don't forget that little people can have a say. It's not just the very wealthy who can control everything that happens. I think the force of voices around the world is exactly what is needed. So please don't despair. Please join us in attempting to change attitudes towards the way we're handling the natural world. We have, for centuries now, I'm talking about the West, been treating the planet as our dustbin.
Mm.
We need to understand that we're not apart from nature, we are a part of nature. And that has to be embedded in our thinking. And once we get that thinking through, we can spread that message around.
I think those are wonderful words to end on. Thank you so, so much for all your time and your wisdom and actually all the work you're doing. And I'm sure that if there's anything you can think of, we would all be very happy to support any of your work. And I can see the report for tomorrow has been posted. Just remains for me to say thank you to everybody for joining. We are up and running with guests for the next year. Really, we've got lots of people in the pipeline for you. So please do join. If you want to unmute now and just say goodbye in whatever language you normally speak, we should do that. And thank you very much, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Louise, thank you. You do a wonderful job.
Arrivederci.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Merci, au
Thank you for
revoir.
the presentation.
Thank you.